welcome to From Challenge to Breakthroughs, New Hope for Brain Health. You're in the VLAB. The VLAB was stood up by a couple of partners this year, West Health Foundation, Gates Ventures, and Gallup. They all came together to create a space to really look at ways to dynamically transform some of the greatest issues of our time. One of them in particular is brain health and what's happening around the brain. Really looking to disrupt aging and to bring some of the greatest solutions of our day, of our time, to these serious issues. I think one of the things that's been different about this space, and I give Shelley Lyford and her team a ton of credit for this, is it's a space that's focused on what's possible. It's a space that's focused on solutions, a space that's focused on bringing together unique actors, universities, foundations, companies, entrepreneurs, investors. And that's what today's about. It's about solutions. It's about ideas. And so to introduce the session, I want to bring up Shelley Lyford, CEO and chairwoman of the West Health Foundation. Shelley, thank you so much for creating this space and having us today.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. And I've seen many of you throughout this week. We've had some amazing programming here, and it is especially exciting to introduce the next panel. So brain health and Alzheimer's in particular are is a defining global challenge. Think about in the world how our world is aging. We think about how brain complexities affect families, economies, and health systems around the world. And what makes this point in our time meaningful is the breakthroughs in diagnostics and treatments and the powerful new AI tools that can help connect fragmented data and accelerate discovery at a global scale. It is a privilege to welcome Bill Gates, chair of the Gates Foundation, and Bernd Montag, the CEO of Siemens Healthineers, to the stage. I think that. Good. So this conversation will be guided by Shankar Vedantam, who is the founder and host of the wildly popular podcast, The Hidden Brain. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is going to be an exciting conversation, a rich conversation. I'm delighted that you are here today. I'm delighted to be in conversation with two of the most esteemed people we could be talking about Alzheimer's and dementia. I want to just start by saying, before I talk about our panelists here, that the subject of dementia and Alzheimer's disease is not just a science subject, and it's not just a medical subject. Dementia cuts very close to the heart in ways that many other medical conditions do not. Many of us have a personal connection with people who've had dementia or who have dementia at the moment. Many of us are frightened about what it means to have dementia. And I think many of us are also afraid that dementia robs us of who we actually are in ways that other medical conditions do not. So even as we talk about the science, the promise, some of the challenges, I want to emphasize that this is also going to be a personal conversation where we'll talk and try and humanize what it is to have these dementias and what we can do about them. Everyone on the stage here, of course, knows Bill Gates. He has been a great industrialist, a technologist, a philanthropist. He's also someone, I think, who has been incredibly thoughtful about how he has deployed his resources and the effects that it's had on global health. And for that, I'm personally grateful to him. I remember Bill and I shared a stage at TED many years ago. He was the opening speaker at the session, and I was the closing speaker. And I quipped when I went on stage that I was the guy for whom Bill Gates opened. And he was kind enough not to hold it against me and to invite me to this session. Also honored here to invite Bernd Montag, who is the CEO of Siemens Healthineers, who's an expert on diagnosis and diagnostics. And as we will see in the story of diagnosis turns out to be an essential story in the story of how we combat Alzheimer's disease. I want to start by asking Bill a couple of questions because his interest and your interest, Bill, in Alzheimer's disease started from a very personal place. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your dad. He was something of a giant in your life, almost literally, very tall man. And I understand from your memoir, Source Code, which you should all read, that Bill, as a kid, was not an easy kid. You were a somewhat challenging child. Tell me about the role that your father played as you were growing up. He was a calming presence in your life.
Yeah, my dad, I was super lucky with both of my parents. My dad was a lawyer. He worked very hard. He always had clear opinions about how kids should behave that I sometimes did not live up to. I'm sure he found me a little confusing at times in terms of my defiance of various things, but he always stayed calm, and I came to appreciate him as I grew older. His advice in the early days of Microsoft were pretty incredible. Even later, I employed a lot of lawyers, but my dad's advice was always the most helpful. And when I decided to start the Gates Foundation, it was actually, I was still going to stay at Microsoft full-time for another 8 years. So this was in 2000 when we became the world's largest foundation. So it was my dad and a woman, Patty Stonecipher, who was a Microsoft executive, who co-ran the foundation for those 8 years before I switched to be full-time at the foundation and retired from my full-time work at Microsoft. So he did a great job. He set the culture of the foundation and had kind of a natural way of understanding things that I always aspired to.
When did he first start developing the symptoms that would eventually become Alzheimer's, Bill? When were you aware of this? When was he aware of this?
In his early 80s, we look back, probably some of the memory things, but it was not until 84, 85 that, he clearly, he was super sophisticated. So, for example, he was on the board of a U.S. retailer, Costco, and, I said to my dad, you should quit the board. And he said, no, I like being on that board. And I said, no, I think you should quit. You have a near perfect reputation, Dad, and you can't read 10 Qs anymore. You should quit. And so he went to the Costco board. He said, look, I think I should stay on this board, but my son says I should quit, and my son is sometimes right, so I guess I'll quit. And he had a very good attitude. And then, at some point, we had to get full-time caretakers, and at some point, his knowledge of things. He went through a period, because he grew up in the Depression, where he was very worried about money. Of course, because he'd had some Microsoft stock, that was not actually a rational thing. But he was always like, do I have enough money? And my poor sister would get called 3 times a day. But then, about 18 months went by, and then money was then too abstract, so at least he stopped worrying about that. But, compared to many patients, he was calm, and then he passed away at 94.
I'm wondering what it was like for you and your family, because at the time your dad was diagnosed, we did not have treatments for Alzheimer's disease. And I'm wondering what it felt like to have a diagnosis that in some ways did not have a treatment.
Well, bizarrely, there's kind of a chicken-egg problem. They don't really often diagnose people with Alzheimer's. I mean, there's not the slightest doubt my dad had Alzheimer's, but weirdly, they never officially, even though, he had the best neurologist at the UW taking care of him, they just decided they didn't want to say that to him. And, there wasn't like some trial that would have enabled him to enroll in or some government benefit, he would have been eligible for. And, our case was a very lucky case because he had these full-time caretakers who, essentially became part of our family, and we still know and talk to. And, they were amazing with him. Most families don't have that. So my dad was able to stay at home and, participate in everything, to the degree possible, literally to the day that he died, and that's very atypical.
My mother passed away about a year ago, and one of the things that she didn't have, she was of sound mind. She died at the age of 93. But I recall that she had many health conditions in the last years of her life. But as my sister and I tried to help her, she would regularly tell us how grateful she was that we were helpful children, that we cared for her, and so forth. One of the challenges that I think many families who are dealing with Alzheimer's experience is that they don't have that connection anymore. Sometimes families call it the long goodbye, where you have the sense that you're saying goodbye to someone who doesn't know that you're saying goodbye to them. Was that the case for you and your family, Bill?
Well, my mom had died much earlier, and my dad had remarried, and and so he'd been married to her for about a decade, Mimi, when he got Alzheimer's. Eventually, he couldn't remember her name, so he'd say the lady, and we'd laugh about it. And he couldn't remember the caretakers' names, but he was such a nice guy. He was always, he couldn't say their names. Did they get food? And so they say that when you get these diseases, sometimes your personality becomes more extreme. Fortunately, in his case, it meant that he was just a very nice guy. He would mostly swear at himself that, he made a mistake or couldn't remember something, and, we tried to calm that down. So I won't say that it was easy, but compared to a lot of cases where, sort of the anger is very strong, that was fairly modest. Some of the medicines he took, they're not disease-curing, but were slightly palliative in terms of mental stress.
Bernd, I want to turn to you for a second. You told me a second earlier that you haven't had an experience with dementia or Alzheimer's in your family directly, but you have had experience with a family member who had brain cancer that in fact changed the way they behaved. Talk a moment about this, the challenge of some of the brain disorders that we are confronting, which is that it's not just you're dealing with a disorder, but you're dealing with somebody who feels like they're a different person than they used to be.
Yeah, I think this is very similar to what Bill describes. So Alzheimer's is maybe not the only disease where you need to, where you run into the difficulty that you, on the one hand, that the patient doesn't feel to be himself, but that it's also extremely difficult for the relatives. And especially it makes a huge difference. Whether you have, it's not nice to have pancreatic cancer, but to be clear until the very end, or when you see the personality of somebody. That was a very, very difficult process. And I think everybody also who has relatives with a mental disorder like bipolar disorders and so on knows what that feels like. When you, it's not a health topic, it's a personality loss in a way. Yeah.
I'm wondering if I can just take a very quick poll of the audience here. How many people in this audience have had firsthand connection with dementia or Alzheimer's disease? How many people? Wow. And how many people in this audience are themselves fearful of dementia and Alzheimer's disease?
Why not?
So let's talk a moment about diagnostics. When I was covering Alzheimer's disease and other neurological conditions for the Washington Post many years ago, I spent a lot of time at the University of Pennsylvania with a researcher named John Trojanowski, and he explained to me that at that time, Alzheimer's disease was diagnosed at autopsy. The idea was a patient died, and then you would conduct an autopsy, and you would discover these plaques and tangles inside the brain, and that's how you knew a person had Alzheimer's. Now, a diagnosis at death is not a useful diagnosis. Talk a little bit about the challenge of diagnosing a disease like Alzheimer's and where we are today, Bernd, in terms of how far we've come.
Yeah, the challenge is in imaging, and so we need to look at imaging and blood-based tests. Yeah, and I start with imaging. The challenge in imaging is that you need to diagnose on a cellular level in an organ where you cannot do biopsies. Yeah, so you cannot. So the brain is from that point of view, a very challenging organ. Yeah, we have lots of other topics where diagnosis made a lot of progress. Yeah, you can detect metastasis, you can diagnose stroke and or look at aneurysms and so on and so on. But when it comes to that level, it is extremely difficult. Yeah, I made the kind of simple analogy. It's like, you get an NVIDIA chip, you don't know how it works, and you have some X-ray or something, and you try to find out how does that whole thing function, or why doesn't it work? Yeah? So, there were two steps now which helped, and there, by the way, the autopsy kind of helped, yeah, because that helped to understand and to track, the amyloid plaque burden to what PET imaging showed. Yeah, so there are now radiopharmaceuticals which exactly bind with the amyloid plaque or tau, depending. I mean, there are two different schools. And then you can see whether amyloid plaque is really there. Yeah, so that is a super important step for the diagnostic piece. And at the same time, we see good progress also in the blood-based markers. And in the end, probably this will be a complementary topic. Yeah?
So again, these are talking about the two markers of Alzheimer's disease in the brain, these amyloid plaques and the neurofibrillary tangle, sometimes called tau. These are the two hallmarks of the disease. There's been some debate about whether these are actually upstream or downstream of the origination of Alzheimer's disease. So in other words, if you have a model where you're thinking about this as like cholesterol, cholesterol eventually causes heart disease, but cholesterol is not heart disease. And so when you have plaques in the arteries, they cause heart disease, but the heart disease, in fact, began somewhere upstream. And so what we have right now are the markers that tell us when a disease is unfolding, but we don't actually know for sure where it is. If I can turn to you, Bill, since your dad passed away, we now have two treatments for Alzheimer's disease. For our audience here, explain sort of where these treatments are, how effective they are. Are they game changers? Are they moving the ball? Where are we right now?
Yeah, so we have Leqembi from Eisai and donanemab from Eli Lilly, which are basically amyloid-clearing antibodies. And so what they've shown is that in full-blown Alzheimer's, these do reduce the rate of decline. They don't stop decline, and depending on how you look at the data, it's either a 20% to 40% reduction in the rate of decline. The hope is that these drugs, or the next generation of them, if given early on, before your amyloid level gets to a certain point, that will prevent the tau, which leads to the brain cell death, that you just won't get Alzheimer's if you don't have the amyloid. And so there's a number of trials outstanding right now, some using those two antibodies, some using the next generation. The other slight difficulty with the current two antibodies is that you develop brain inflammation called, Alzheimer's-related imaging.
Amyloid-related
Imaging.
ARIA.
Abnormality. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
It takes a village. It takes a village.
But which when you do develop that, it's probably quite damaging to brain function. And so the current drugs are not without some negative. And the next generation, the hope is that the risk of ARIA is greatly reduced and that we can go from having to go into the medical center to be infused to actually being able to self-treat at home. And Roche, Eli Lilly, a bunch of companies have these products coming. So the very best case would be that you would get a regular blood test to see your amyloid, of which there's a pretty good one right now. You might do a PET scan for confirmation, depending on how that looks. And then you would start taking this amyloid clearing drug, and your risk of getting Alzheimer's would be dramatically reduced. I'm an optimist. I believe there's a very good chance that over the next 5 years, all those pieces will come into place.
So in some ways, this is really almost turning this into like a heart disease model, where you're basically saying, I get a cholesterol test when I'm 40 or 45. I don't have heart disease, but I have elevated cholesterol. We know that elevated cholesterol will lead to heart disease, and so I take medications to try and bring my cholesterol under control and hopefully never get heart disease.
That's the hope.
How likely do you think this is, Bill?
Well, I've been involved in funding the diagnostic and working with Eli Lilly and encourage pharmacy companies not to give up on Alzheimer's. So I'm hardly an unbiased observer, and I've been lucky enough. My experience at Microsoft rewarded me for taking high risk. My work at the Gates Foundation, the number of things that have paid off is over half of all the high-risk things we've done. My work through Breakthrough Energy on climate innovation, so I'm often accused of being over-optimistic. And, in this case, though it's serious work and it'll be subject to, gigantic phase 3 trials to see if it's true. Personally, if I had a high amyloid level today, I'm lucky I don't, but I would even consider taking the current clearing drugs. I mean, it's that, you're facing the development of Alzheimer's versus the risk of the side effect and the inconvenience of the current way that you access those drugs. And these trials that are out are, will help us understand that. It looks like the side effect, they don't unblind to tell you whether active versus placebo is having the side effect, but the total side effect level in these trials is so low that it suggests that they really are a generation beyond Leqembi and donanemab.
Bernd, I'm wondering, you talked a second ago about the complexity of imaging the brain. In some ways, I think even though we have made tremendous progress, our ability to understand what's happening at a cellular level in the brain is probably like, as you said a second ago when we were chatting upstairs, like taking a photograph of a city from an airplane. So you can tell a lot about the city, you can tell what's happening in the different neighborhoods, you can tell what the downtown area is, but if someone were to ask you, why is it more people are going from one neighborhood to another? Why is it people are not going from one neighborhood to another? We don't have the kind of granular information to make that. Is it possible that we will one day get there?
I think we will slowly get there, yeah. Because when you look at what technologies are out there and on the imaging side, I think the most promising topic here when it comes to really understanding how the brain functions on a cellular level is MRI, yeah, where there are methods to find out, everybody knows probably the images of functional MRI where you know what areas of the brain are activated when certain exercises are done. There's a program we have, the Connectome, yeah, which shows basically let's say the highways in the city, I would say, yeah. So you see, where are the main nerve fibers, which is even used clinically now when you do tumor resection. And so on, and I think there's also a lot of additional work where, probably everybody knows that there's a lot of work now going into this BCIs, the brain-computer interface. Yeah, one can have different opinions on this. Yeah, it's one of the dual-use topics, but it also shows you can only build a good brain-computer interface when you understand how the brain functions in detail, yeah, and I believe that step by step we will get there, yeah. Also because more powerful MRIs and then also AI to accelerate the images will help us. Yeah.
Let's switch to a slightly different topic. Both of you have been interested in the issue of system integration and the fact that there are many parts of the treatment and approach to Alzheimer's disease that do not talk to each other or do not talk well to each other. Let me stay with you for a second, Bernd. Talk about why this is an issue. From a layperson's point of view, it seems like this shouldn't be a problem. You have a bunch of information coming in from imaging, from clinical information. Everyone should be sharing information, and we should have good systems. Why does that not happen?
I think, and this is, there's always a ton of discussions about this in Davos, yeah. How to make healthcare better from a system point of view. And I think the talk track is relatively simple. The healthcare system has been built for infectious disease and for acute episodes. What healthcare today is about managing the non-communicable diseases. Yeah, it's cancer, it is cardiovascular disease,
diabetes,
it is diabetes,
chronic diseases,
the chronic diseases, and it's Alzheimer's. And that requires that it's a process. You need early detection, you need information sharing longitudinally, and the system is not really built for this yet. There is hope, yeah, because when you look at a Kaiser Permanente, when you look at the accountable care organization type topics, the health systems in the US, or when you look at the NHS, there are entities who can optimize the whole system, yeah, or there are specialties like the MD Anderson Cancer Center, yeah. So, but I believe what is necessary is when it comes to establishing something like treating Alzheimer's, you need some kind of a recipient who does this as the main job instead of convincing everybody. And one maybe philosophical comment in the end. Alzheimer is a disease which was very late in human discovery. Yeah? I think 1860 or so when Alzheimer was detected. Yeah? So we didn't know about it, yeah, for good reasons, because people died before. Right. It might be that it's a gift that Alzheimer is so late to the game because potentially it's the first digital native or AI native in getting treated. Yeah, while in all the other diseases, you need to make the players come together, yeah, because the system is already built. Yeah, so this is maybe an opportunity we should bear in mind, that we don't replicate all the issues we had with the other diseases. Yeah.
Bill, starting in 2017 and ramping up then in 2023, this has become a major focus for you. You have 5 different pillars in terms of your funding for Alzheimer's disease, but one of them is this idea of interoperability, and that sounds like a very clunky word and about systems. Talk about the challenge here from a research perspective as well as from a diagnosis and treatment perspective, why system integration is going to be central to our future success.
Well, the brain is by far the most complex organ, and it's easier to say we know very little about the brain. You know, we don't even know how knowledge is stored, and so there's still a great deal of mystery about Alzheimer's. I mean, there's some things we know about where in the hippocampus you see cell death, and we know the symptoms, but even the question of, is it multiple paths that get you that disease? Is it glial cell activation through some autoimmune trigger? Is it something about your mitochondria and the energy factory that as you get late in life, your brain cells essentially don't have enough energy to clear the things that cause this disease? And I was fairly stunned at how little data was available for a researcher who wanted to go in and look and see longitudinally, okay, what's going on with the various markers. A miracle is that our tools that can actually measure protein concentrations, these tools have gotten incredibly good. And so one thing we've been able to do is go to people who did Alzheimer's trials and say, can we get all of your blood samples and your patient records and make those available on a common platform to people doing Alzheimer's research? And then we take and we pay for those blood samples to go into the very latest protein analyzers, which are highly suggestive of multipaths to the acquisition of this disease. But now that data is there for various people to look at. That data, nobody was there to fund the digitization of it, to standardize the format of it, to make sure that the very complex privacy issues were dealt with. When you were permissioned into the trial, you didn't get permission for it to be used for general research. So in some cases, you have to go back and get permission. Sometimes that's complicated because the person has passed away. But anyway, by going to Alzheimer's research centers, not just in the US, but in the UK and Europe, we've now figured out what should this format look like and what do researchers want. So we have the Alzheimer's workbench that lets you navigate that data. And we just had, so it fundamentally empowers Alzheimer's researchers in a new way. We just had a contest where we said, hey, if you are using AI to look at this data, we'll help fund your work. And we had like 30 applications. I think we picked 4 winners and 5. Okay, it was quite impressive. Even some of the ones that didn't win, I thought, hey, that's not bad. And so, between sequencing data and protein measurement data and the ability to have these image analysis, which AIs are very, very good at, we're laying the groundwork to have some fundamental understanding of the brain and Alzheimer's specifically that didn't exist before. And somehow that, creating that platform for sharing, it's only recently that came together and achieved a critical mass.
So is one of the barriers here, there are many companies that are interested in developing treatments for Alzheimer's disease, but the companies also have financial incentives to want to hold information secret. Is that a barrier at all to sharing information, Bill? Is the commercial interest that we have in combating it, which are obviously very helpful in driving innovation and funding innovation, can they also be a barrier in sharing information?
Well, a lot of the pharma companies have been fantastic partners on this. I think Johnson & Johnson was the first to come to us and say that if we took the marginal cost of doing it, that they would help us get this data. Now we're working with many others on expanding that data set. Pharma companies are fairly conservative about, could we get into privacy problems? The place where you have the most general data is things that started as public studies. So the Framingham Heart Study, which expanded to be a more broader health study, that's a fantastic piece of data. In fact, we're collaborating with them to go back and look and understand Alzheimer's in particular, or brain disease more broadly, using that data set, which is an incredible longitudinal data set. And there, at least, you had permission, going back a long time, and they preserved a lot of blood samples that now we're doing this new analysis on. But there was a period where pharma had failed so many times with Alzheimer's drugs that there was a risk that they would all leave the field. I mean, these are the most expensive phase 3s that there are, because your measurement is so noisy of these cognitive tests that your trial size and your trial time period gets gigantic. And so these can be easily billion-dollar dry holes. And, thank God, some efficacy was shown with actually 3 antibodies, but one is gone now because it wasn't as good. So the 2, they're getting somewhat of a market. So that did help keep people in this field. So my experience with pharma is a very, very positive experience, that if you go approach them in the right way, they want to help out. Sometimes if they have really hot data, they'll say, okay, we want an exclusive for 3 years on this data. And that's fine, because there's a lot of older data that can really form the foundation.
I mean, this actually speaks also to the importance of diagnosis, because with recruiting patients for clinical trials, one of the challenges was you had to wait fairly far into the process before you could recruit patients. But as you're able to diagnose these with blood samples earlier and earlier, it becomes easier to recruit patients, and patient recruitment has been a major barrier in some ways to the development of these interventions.
Yeah, because you don't get diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and because you have to go in and do PET scans, it was very expensive. You had to have somebody who was willing to give a lot of their time. You'd have often 70% of people wouldn't meet the screening test, so you spent money to try to qualify them. There was no pool of people standing by. I mean, what you should have is a registry where people at various conditions are there, and when you have a new drug, you say, okay, I want people who are ApoE44, I'll go and get those people. Or I want people from a particular geography or racial background, and you can go and find those patient pools. And so the field is getting slightly better at patient recruiting, and the blood tests will play a role there. Also, taking these cognitive tests and standardizing them and improving the quality of those, that's another thing. And there are some other things like ocular tests or speech pattern tests that may come into the mix as well. And so it was amazing to me that the amount of money we had to spend to fund the diagnostic work was like, $100 million, which in the game in terms of the cost of Alzheimer's, it's kind of nothing. We were very lucky that, some people had been working on some of these antibodies, and fairly quickly there were 4 or 5 that were promising, and one of those looks the P217 looks very strong.
Bernd, I'm wondering if I can come to you for a second. Both of you have mentioned AI in passing in terms of its potential in helping us develop either better diagnoses, better treatments, interventions. Talk about this. What is the potential of AI in this field?
So I believe, I mean, on top of what AI does in the fields of imaging anyway, in accelerating exams or automating the analysis, that in the end, I think what Bill also described is it happens in primary care. Yeah, you need, there's the blood test, there's maybe we find ways, like alterations of speech or simple memory tests or whatever, So, and the question is now, do we need to train all GPs on this planet, to do this? Or isn't this something where we can say this is AI first? I don't want to throw out, buzzwords, but this is, in my opinion, one of the prime use cases of an agentic AI, basically, to say, okay, this is an Alzheimer diagnosis companion.
For screening, you mean?
For screening and for this, for making, first of all, how to have a dialogue with the patient, how to interpret this, because probably it will remain noisy, to, there's the blood test, but as you also said, not everybody with high cholesterol has heart disease, so there's the blood test, then you need to, maybe we will find early signs of cognitive function, which people need to be able to diagnose, and I think their AI can, in my opinion, really help to democratize this at the front line, so to say.
Bill, one of the first studies I read about Alzheimer's disease, this was many, many years ago, involved a study of nuns who kept diaries in their early 20s. And it found that the nuns who had actually written the most and wrote the best in their early 20s had a lower risk of cognitive decline in older age. And so there's been other lines of research that suggest that cognitive activity, intense cognitive activity, learning new things can be protective in terms of what happens with Alzheimer's disease and other mental health conditions. And I feel like this is actually relevant to the AI question, because AI, especially for many young people, is causing them to say, I don't have to write this history paper. I can ask ChatGPT to write it for me. And yes, you get your assignment done, but is there a risk that there's going to be a mental de-skilling that could actually increase the likelihood that we're seeing cognitive decline in later age?
Well, there's never been a definitive answer to whether this correlation of diagnosing Alzheimer's, that it comes later for college educated or if you know more languages. Is that simply that the redundancy of a brain that's very well exercised manages to mask, 10% of the hippocampus is gone, 20% is gone, that you simply are developing redundant strong pathways. So at the very least, it's better for you because your cognition stays stronger longer. But actually the underlying biology, sadly, you probably had a certain level of cell death. That college education may not specifically work at the cellular level, but rather be a symptom more of a systems property that comes out of it. If you have a concussion when you're a kid, you're more likely to get Alzheimer's. And so a lot of things weigh in. Your ApoE genes, particularly in Caucasians, we understand how that affects your age-related risk in a very dramatic way. We still don't understand mechanistically exactly what's going on there. Yes, it probably connects to amyloid in certain ways or glial cell activation in certain ways, but I'm amazed, compared to, say, malaria. We know a lot about malaria. We haven't solved it yet, but it's a, more mechanistically, fully characterized disease than any neurological disease, including Alzheimer's. One of the diagnostic things that's been amazing is more and more it looks like some people have pure Alzheimer's, some people have Alzheimer's together with other diseases, and some things look like Alzheimer's that are not Alzheimer's. And so we've been grouping, whenever you just use symptoms, to group things, you're missing a lot. And so as this era of testing goes on and protein analysis, the ability to subdivide, to look at people who are experiencing, sadly, multiple of these things at the same time and understanding, okay, what do you do in those cases? We're going to look back on this era as a really dumb, brute force era for all of these things.
One last question to you, Bill. So much of your work with the Gates Foundation and your work in global health has focused on the global south and people in poor countries. Even with people in rich countries, the treatment and management of Alzheimer's is challenging and it's difficult. But there's no question that in the years to come, 80% or more of the burden of these dementias are going to fall in poor countries. Is there a hopeful story to tell there?
Well, so I do my Alzheimer's work outside of the Gates Foundation. I have a great team under Naranjan Bose that manages that work for me. And the reason I do it that way is the foundation work is very much on what is the most effective way to spend dollars to save lives. And we typically do things there. We save a life for $1,000 to $2,000. You could say that in the long run, if all this research works out, the net effect will actually be money saving to society, because the burden of Alzheimer's is so unbelievable, even just the pure economics, not to mention the emotional effect on both the patient and the family of the patient. So, it's unbelievable. And if you were the U.S. government and you were saying, hey, what does my balance sheet look like 30 years from now? The difference if you cure or prevent people from getting Alzheimer's, say 90% versus you don't, you could say, okay, I only can invest $100 billion to, if I have a 50% chance of having that reduction, I've got $100 billion. So society is irrationally underinvesting in neurological disease, Alzheimer's in particular, because it is so expensive. And as we say, that's not the full measure of it. National Institute of Aging, now they've got a significant budget. It looks like, there was a threat it would be cut. It looks like it may not be cut. That's definitely good news. They spend a lot of money on Alzheimer's. So when I came into it, I was like, wow, I'm not going to spend as much as NIA does. Are there particular things that just don't fit the way they see it? And it turned out the diagnostics or gathering the database, we found a few things that were somewhat catalytic. So I feel very good about that. I do hope, and the Gates Foundation is not just about infectious disease. It turns out those are the things today, like measles vaccines, you can save lives. But we're going to get blood pressure medicines and cholesterol medicines and GLP-1 medicines out to the developing world as the cost comes down. There's siRNA forms of GLP-1 drugs that you might just take once a year, and the COGS on that is $2. So more and more things come into that $1,000 per life saved through the miracle of innovation, and I hope that Alzheimer's gets to that point. Besides the antibodies, there were some drugs. They failed completely, but now we're back looking at those as interfering with amyloid, and if that happens to work, those would be much cheaper to the cost of goods on these. The antibodies are still fairly high, but if we can use the drug approach, then it would get to be economic for lots and lots of patients within the next decade.
I want to ask everyone here to remain seated as we transition to the next session. Joe Daly from Gallup is going to be presenting some new and very interesting data on Americans' beliefs and attitudes about dementia. But I want to thank Bernd and I want to thank Bill for what has been really an exhilarating and deeply honest conversation. Thank you so much.